I never thought my own son would erase me from my life's work. The day Alaric moved me into Magnolia Manor, I was holding the crystal paperweight from my first board meeting in 1987, the one where I convinced 12 men to trust a woman with their money, 40 years of building Larkhill Capital, of proving myself in every room I entered, of creating something that mattered. All of it suddenly meant nothing to him. "It's for your own good, Mother," he said, his voice gentle, but his eyes calculating. "You need proper care after the stroke. But what if everything I built wasn't really gone? What if the son who abandoned me was about to work for the very empire he tried to steal?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Zephyr Larkhill, and I suppose I should start with the truth about power. Real power isn't what they teach you in business school. Real power is what you build when the world tells you that you don't belong, when every door closes before you even knock, when your own family sees you as currency rather than legacy. I built Larkhill Capital from nothing, not the romantic nothing that privileged people claim when they start with family money and connections. I mean actual nothing. A teenage runaway from a fundamentalist compound in rural Georgia, pregnant at 19, widowed at 23, with nothing but a sharp mind and an unshakable belief that intelligence should trump inheritance in investment decisions. The year was 1983 when I walked into that cramped office above Henderson's used books on Ponce de Leon Avenue. The rent was $200 a month, which was exactly what I could afford after working double shifts as a bookkeeper for 3 different small businesses. The space smelled like old paper and dreams deferred, but it was mine. I painted the walls myself a soft grey that would look professional in photographs, and bought a second-hand desk from an estate sale in Buckhead. My first client was Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez, an 80-year-old widow who had been burned by every financial advisor she'd trusted with her late husband's pension. She sat across from my borrowed desk, studying me with the kind of skepticism that comes from a lifetime of disappointment. "Young lady," she said, "why should I trust you with my money when Wells Fargo wouldn't even give you a loan for this office?" I could have lied. I could have inflated my credentials or invented a prestigious background. Instead, I told her the truth, because, Mrs. Vasquez, I understand what it feels like to have everything you've worked for dismissed by people who've never had to fight for anything. I understand what it means to be invisible, and I promise you this: I will never make you feel that way. She invested $5,000 with me that day. Within 6 months, I had turned it into $8,000. Word spread through the tight-knit communities that banks ignored immigrants, single mothers, small business owners who had been deemed too risky for traditional investment firms. They came to me because I saw them, really saw them, the way I had desperately wanted to be seen. By 1987, I had enough capital to move to a real office in Midtown. By 1990, I was managing portfolios worth over $10 million. By 1995, the major firms that had once refused to interview me were trying to poach my clients. But I had learned something crucial in those early years: loyalty isn't bought with promises or prestige. It's earned through consistent respect and understanding. The Atlanta Journal-Constitution did a feature on me in 1998, calling me one of the city's most influential women under 40. The photographer captured me at my desk, the marked blank pen that I'd bought to celebrate my first $1 million client acquisition gleaming in my hand. That pen became my signature at every major signing, every partnership agreement, every milestone that marked Larkhill Capital's growth from a one-woman operation to a boutique firm managing over $200 million in assets. I married Richard Larkhill in 1985. A kind-hearted professor of literature at Emory who understood that my work wasn't just a career, it was a calling. He never resented the long hours or the business dinners or the fact that his wife's name was on billboards throughout the city while he's remained in academic obscurity. Richard supported my ambition with the quiet confidence of a man who knew. His worth wasn't measured by his wife's success. Alaric was born in 1988, and I thought I had achieved something close to perfection. A thriving business, a loving marriage, and a son who would inherit not just wealth, but the knowledge of how to build something meaningful from nothing. I imagined teaching him the patience required for long-term investments, the empathy needed to truly understand what clients needed, the integrity that had built every relationship I valued. Richard died suddenly of a heart attack when Alaric was 12. The grief nearly destroyed me, but the business kept me grounded. My clients, many of whom had become friends over the years, rallied around me with a support that no amount of money could have purchased. Mrs. Vasquez, then in her 90s, brought me homemade soup every week for months. She would sit in my office and tell me stories about her own losses, reminding me that survival was its own form of success. Alaric took his father's death harder than I initially realized. He became withdrawn, angry at a world that had taken away the one parent who had time for bedtime stories and weekend baseball games. I tried to fill both roles, but Larkhill Capital demanded constant attention, especially as we navigated the increasingly complex financial landscape of the late 1990s and early 2000s. I hired the best tutors, sent him to the finest schools, made sure he had every opportunity that had been denied to me. But somewhere along the way, I failed to teach him the most important lesson of all, that respect isn't inherited. It's earned through your actions, your character, your ability to lift up others rather than stepping on them. Alaric graduated from Duke with a business degree in 2010 and immediately expected a senior position at Larkhill Capital. When I insisted he start in an entry-level role and prove himself like any other employee, he accused me of playing favourites with my other junior associates. When I refused to hand him high-profile clients without the experience to serve them properly, he claimed I was sabotaging his career. He left the firm in 2013 to start his own investment company, funded by a loan that I co-signed against my better judgment. The business failed within 18 months, along with 2 subsequent ventures that hemorrhaged money faster than I could have imagined. Each failure was accompanied by elaborate explanations about market conditions, timing, and circumstances beyond his control. Never once did he acknowledge that success required more than just access to capital. By 2020, Alaric was 42 years old, twice divorced, and living in a Buckhead condo that I was still paying for. Our relationship had devolved into quarterly dinners where he presented new business plans and I politely declined to fund them. He had become a stranger wearing my son's face, someone who saw me not as his mother, but as an obstacle to what he believed he deserved. The stroke happened on a Tuesday morning in March 2023. I was reviewing quarterly reports when the words on the page suddenly became meaningless symbols, swimming before my eyes like alphabet soup. The left side of my body felt heavy, disconnected, as if it belonged to someone else. I managed to press the emergency button on my desk phone before consciousness slipped away. I woke up in Emory Hospital 3 days later to find Alaric sitting beside my bed, his face a carefully composed mask of concern. The doctors explained that I had suffered a minor ischemic stroke, that my prognosis was excellent, that with proper rest and rehabilitation I could expect to make a full recovery. "Mother," Alaric said, taking my hand with a gentleness I hadn't felt from him in years, "we need to talk about your care. The doctors say you shouldn't be living alone anymore. You need proper supervision, medical support. I've found a wonderful place, Magnolia Manor. It's the finest care facility in Atlanta." The way he said it, so reasonable and loving, made me want to believe that this was genuine concern rather than opportunity. But something in his eyes, a flicker of anticipation, perhaps made me pause. Still, I was exhausted, overwhelmed by the medical decisions and insurance forms and the terrifying realization that my body had betrayed me without warning. "Let me think about it," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I could see him calculating, planning, moving pieces on a board where I was no longer a play, but merely a piece to be positioned. The papers he brought me to sign were extensive, filled with legal language that my post-stroke brain struggled to process. Power of attorney, medical directives, temporary management agreements for the firm. "Just until you're fully recovered," he assured me. "Just to make sure everything is handled properly while you focus on getting better." I signed them. God help me. I signed everyone. Magnolia Manor was everything Alaric had promised: elegant, expensive, and utterly isolating. The Georgian mansion sat on 15 manicured acres in Buckhead, its white columns and wrap-around porches designed to evoke southern grace rather than institutional care. My suite on the second floor had crown molding, hardwood floors, and windows that overlooked gardens where other residents shuffled along paved paths like well-dressed ghosts. The staff treated me with the kind of professional kindness reserved for people who were no longer considered capable of making their own decisions. They spoke slowly, smiled constantly, and asked about my comfort while ignoring my questions. About my business, my accounts, my life beyond these perfumed walls. "Mrs. Larkhill," said Patricia, the head nurse, a woman whose cheerfulness felt as artificial as the silk flowers in the lobby, "your son has arranged for all your business affairs to be handled externally. You don't need to worry about any of that anymore. Your only job is to rest and recover." But I wasn't recovering. If anything, I felt myself disappearing, becoming smaller and less substantial with each passing day. The stroke had been minor. I knew this from the medical records I had read before signing them over to Alaric. My speech was clear, my memory intact, my reasoning abilities unimpaired. Yet here I was, surrounded by people who spoke to me as if I were a child who had lost her capacity for complex thought. It was during my third week at Magnolia Manor that I discovered the truth about Alaric's intentions. I had been struggling with insomnia, a common side effect of the medications they had prescribed, and decided to take a walk through the quiet corridors. As I passed the administrative offices, I heard voices coming from Patricia's office. One of them unmistakably my son's. "The transition needs to be seamless," Alaric was saying. "The board of directors has already approved the temporary management structure. Once we can establish a pattern of cognitive decline, the temporary arrangements can become permanent." "Mr. Larkhill," Patricia's voice was cautious, "the medical records don't support a diagnosis of dementia or significant cognitive impairment. Your mother's attending physician has been quite clear about her prognosis. Prognosis can change." Alaric replied smoothly, "especially in elderly patients who have experienced the stress of a stroke. I'm sure Dr. Whitman would agree that institutional care might reveal cognitive issues that weren't apparent in the acute care setting." I pressed myself against the wall outside the office, my heart pounding so loudly I was certain they would hear it. Through the partially open door, I could see Alaric leaning forward in his chair, his posture radiating the kind of confidence I had once mistaken for competence. "The important thing," he continued, "is that my mother receives the best possible care while the business continues to operate effectively. I've already identified several underperforming assets that need to be liquidated. The real estate portfolio alone is worth at least $50 million, and most of it is tied up in properties that haven't appreciated at market rates." Patricia shuffled some papers. "I'm not comfortable with the Patricia," Alaric's voice took on a harder edge. "Magnolia Manor receives a very generous monthly payment for my mother's care. I would hate for any misunderstandings about her condition to jeopardize that arrangement." especially since I know you have several residents whose families are behind on their payments. The silence that followed was thick with implication. I had heard enough. I made my way back to my room on unsteady legs, not from the stroke, but from the realization that my own son was orchestrating my erasure with the clinical precision of a corporate takeover. The next morning, I called Mara Klein from the phone. In my room, Mara had been my CFO for 15 years before retiring to care for her wife, Alana, during her final battle with cancer. If anyone would tell me the truth about what was happening to my company, it would be Mara. Zephyra, Mara's voice was sharp with surprise. Where the hell are you? Alaric told everyone you were in intensive care, that visitors weren't allowed. I'm at Magnolia Manor, I said, keeping my voice low. Mara, I need you to tell me exactly what's happening at the firm. What she told me made my blood run cold. Alaric had indeed convinced the board that I was incapacitated and unable to resume my duties. He had presented medical documentation I had never seen, suggesting that my stroke had caused significant cognitive impairment and that my recovery was uncertain at best. He's moving fast. Zeph, Mara said, the Riverside property deal is being restructured. The pension fund investments are being shifted to more liquid assets. He's basically liquidating everything you spent 40 years building, claiming it's for your long-term care needs. The board approved this. They think they're protecting your interests. Alaric presented it as a temporary conservatorship to preserve your assets during your recovery. But ZEPH... Mara's voice dropped. Some of these moves don't make financial sense unless he's planning to cash out entirely. I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of my naivety. I had raised a son who saw my life's work not as a legacy to preserve, but as an inheritance to liquidate. Mara, I need your help. Anything. Can you get copies of the documentation Alaric presented to the board? I need to see exactly what he's claiming about my condition. 3 days later, Mara arrived at Magnolia Manor during visiting hours, carrying what appeared to be a gift basket filled with books and magazines. Hidden beneath the cheerful cellophane wrapping were photocopies of medical reports I had never seen, financial projections that painted my company as a failing enterprise, and legal opinions that supported the liquidation of my assets as a prudent financial strategy. The medical reports were the most damning. According to Dr. Marcus Whitman, a physician I had never met, my stroke had resulted in significant executive function deficits and progressive cognitive decline consistent with post-stroke dementia. The reports recommended immediate and indefinite institutional care, with regular reassessments to monitor my declining capacity for independent decision-making. This is fraudulent, I told Mara, my hands shaking as I held the fabricated medical records. I never saw this doctor. These assessments never happened. I know, Mara said grimly. I've been doing some research on Dr. Whitman. He runs a small practice that specializes in competency evaluations for wealthy families. His reports almost always support whatever outcome his clients are paying for. The financial projections were equally damaging. Alaric had painted Larkhill Capital as a struggling firm hemorrhaging money due to my erratic decision-making in the months before my stroke. According to his analysis, the company's portfolio had underperformed the market by significant margins, and several major clients were threatening to leave due to concerns about leadership instability. None of it was true. I had reviewed our quarterly reports the morning of my stroke, and Larkhill Capital was performing exceptionally well. Our client retention rate was above 90%, and our portfolio had outperformed the S&P 500 by substantial margins for 3 consecutive years. He's playing a long game, Mara observed. First, establish incompetence, then liquidate assets to pay for your care. Finally, dissolve the firm and walk away with whatever's left. How long do I have? Based on the timeline he's presented to the board, 6 months before the major asset sales begin. maybe 8 before he starts shuttering client accounts. That night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling of my elegant prison, listening to the sounds of Magnolia Manor settling around me. In the distance, I could hear someone crying, a sound that seemed to capture the collective grief of everyone who had been warehoused here by families who found them inconvenient. But I wasn't some helpless elderly woman whose time had passed. I was Zephyr Larkhill, and I had built my empire by refusing to accept other people's limitations. I had survived a fundamentalist compound, single motherhood, widowhood, and 40 years in a male-dominated industry. I would not be defeated by my own son's greed, and a system designed to silence inconvenient elderly voices. The plan began to form in my mind as I watched the sunrise through my window. It would require patience, careful coordination, and a willingness to disappear completely before I could return. But if Alaric wanted to erase me from my own life, I would show him just how dangerous it was to underestimate a woman who had nothing left to lose. I reached for the phone and dialed Mara's number. "It's me," I said when she answered. "Are you ready to help me take back my life?" The escape from Magnolia Manor required more planning than a military operation and more acting ability than I knew I possessed. For 3 weeks, I played the role of a gradually declining elderly woman, complying with medications that made me drowsy, participating in activities that bored me senseless, and submitting to the patronizing kindness of staff members who genuinely believed they were helping me. The key to my liberation turned out to be Deborah Charles, a night nurse who had grown up in rural Alabama caring for her grandmother with dementia. Unlike the day shift staff, who treated residents like expensive furniture that needed occasional dusting, Deborah saw people. Real people with histories and dreams and capabilities that extended beyond their medical charts. "Mrs. Larkhill," she said one evening as she checked my blood pressure, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Why are you here?" "I mean, I've read your file, and nothing about your condition suggests you need this level of care. You're ambulatory, mentally acute, and physically capable. Most of our residents... She gestured toward the hallway, where we could hear the confused wandering of someone with advanced Alzheimer's. "They need us, you don't?" It was the first time in a month that someone had spoken to me as if I were a competent adult, rather than a fragile child. "My son believes I need supervision after my stroke." "Your son isn't a doctor." Deborah's voice was carefully neutral, but I could hear the skepticism underneath. "And Dr. Peterson, who actually examined you, told me your recovery has been remarkable." "She's confused about why you're still here." Dr. Peterson was the facility's attending physician, a woman in her 60s who had taken over my care from the mysterious Dr. Whitman. Unlike Whitman, she actually examined me, asked me questions about my symptoms, and seemed puzzled by the disconnect between my presentation and my medical file. "Deborah," I said carefully, "what would you say if I told you I didn't want to be here? That I never wanted to come here in the first place?" She was quiet for a long moment, taking my blood pressure with the careful attention of someone buying time to think. "I'd say that's between you and your family, Mrs. Larkhill. But I'd also say that everyone deserves to make their own choices about their life, as long as they're capable of making them. And if someone capable of making those choices was being prevented from doing so," Deborah met my eyes directly, "then I'd say that person might need help from someone who believes in doing what's right instead of what's convenient." That conversation was the beginning of my resurrection. Over the following week, Deborah and I developed a plan that was audacious in its simplicity. She would arrange for me to be transferred to Emory for additional neurological testing, a request that Dr. Peterson agreed to after I complained of recurring headaches. Once at the hospital, I would simply leave through the main entrance and disappear into the city I had called home for decades. The morning of my fake transfer, I felt like a teenager again, sneaking out of the compound where I had been held, against my will by people who claimed to love me. Deborah helped me into the transport wheelchair with theatrical care, making sure the orderlies saw an elderly woman who needed assistance, rather than a capable person planning her escape. "Mrs. Larkhill," she said loudly enough for others to hear, "I'll see you when you get back from your tests. You take care of yourself, you hear?" Then, quietly, as she leaned over to adjust my blanket, "There's a coffee shop called Java Jive, 3 blocks south of the hospital. She'd be waiting for you." Mara was indeed waiting, sitting at a corner table with a large coffee and a newspaper, looking like any other Atlantan catching up on the morning news. When I walked through the door, not shuffled or stumbled, she looked up with a grin that took 20 years off her face. Well, she said. "Look what the cat dragged in." I sat across from her, marveling at the simple pleasure of choosing my own seat, my own drink, my own company. Phase 1 complete. Phase 2 is going to be more complicated. Mara pulled a manila envelope from her purse and slid it across the table. "Meet C.L. Hale, management consultant and investment advisor." Inside the envelope were documents that represented a new identity crafted with legal precision. Z.L. Hale had been born in Charleston, South Carolina, educated at Georgetown and Wharton, and had spent 30 years building a reputation as a turnaround specialist for struggling financial firms. The identity was backed by carefully constructed credit history, professional references, and even a modest social media presence that suggested a private person who preferred results to publicity. "How did you, Gerald?" Mara said, referring to my longtime legal advisor. "Turns out creating a legitimate business identity is surprisingly easy when you have the right connections and unlimited resources. Z.L. Hale is completely legal, properly documented, and utterly untraceable to Zephyr Larkhill. Gerald Sumner had been my attorney since 1985, a quiet man who specialized in the kind of complex financial structures that allowed wealthy people to move money and assets without attracting attention. When Mara had approached him with my request, he had shown no surprise at all. "Mrs. Larkhill," he had told her, "I've been waiting 40 years for someone to challenge her son's assumptions about female capabilities. This will be my pleasure." The apartment that Z.L. Hale rented was a modest 2-bedroom in Virginia Highland, furnished with the kind of tasteful anonymity that suggested success without ostentation. The rent was paid a year in advance, the utilities were connected under my new name, and the mailbox bore the discreet brass nameplate of someone who valued privacy above recognition. For the first time in 6 weeks, I slept in my own bed, ate food I had chosen, and woke up when my body decided it was time rather than when institutional schedules demanded it. The freedom was intoxicating, but it also highlighted just how much I had lost and how much I intended to reclaim. The physical transformation took another month. Z.L. Hale needed to look different enough from Zephyr Larkhill that casual observers wouldn't make the connection, but similar enough that I could maintain the disguise comfortably. A skilled colorist in Buckhead gave me silver blonde hair instead of my natural grey. A personal shopper helped me select clothes that suggested corporate success without the distinctive style that had been my signature for decades. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But the most important change was psychological. Zephyr Larkhill had been a pioneer, a woman who had broken barriers through sheer force of will and talent. Z.L. Hale would be something different, a quiet professional who got results without seeking credit, who influenced outcomes from the shadows rather than commanding attention from center stage. The hardest part was learning to be invisible. For 40 years, I had been recognized everywhere I went in Atlanta. Restaurant hostesses knew my preferences, bank managers greeted me by name, and business journalists regularly sought my opinions on market trends. Z.L. Hale had no such recognition, no accumulated respect, no history of proven success. It was humbling in ways I hadn't anticipated. Walking into meetings where no one knew my track record where my opinions carried no automatic weight, where I had to prove myself all over again. But it was also liberating. For the first time in decades, I could observe without being observed, could listen without the expectation of immediate response, could assess situations with the clarity that comes from having no predetermined role to play. Mara became my window into what was happening at Larkhill Capital during my absence. The reports she brought were increasingly alarming. Alaric had accelerated his timeline, apparently confident that his mother was safely tucked away and would remain invisible for the foreseeable future. He's brought in his own management team, she told me during one of our weekly coffee meetings. People who owe their positions to him rather than to the firm's history or values. The culture is changing fast. What about the clients? That's the interesting part. The long-term clients, the ones you personally recruited and develop relationships with. They're asking questions. Mrs. Vasquez called the office last week demanding to speak with you directly. When they told her you were unavailable indefinitely, she threatened to withdraw her entire portfolio. Mrs. Vasquez, 97 years old and still sharp as a blade, had been my first client and remained one of my most loyal. Her portfolio had grown from that initial $5,000 investment to over $2 million. And her referrals had brought me dozens of other clients over the years. What did Alaric tell her? That you were receiving the best possible care, but were no longer able to manage client relationships. He offered to personally oversee her account with the same attention you had always provided. She didn't buy it. She told him, and I quote, "Young man, your mother built her reputation by treating me like a person rather than an account number. If you think you can maintain that relationship by talking to me like I'm a senile old woman who doesn't understand money, you are sadly mistaken." I couldn't help but smile. Mrs. Vasquez had been challenging assumptions about elderly women's capabilities long before I met her. What's she going to do? She's given him 6 months to prove he can manage her money as effectively as you did. If he can't, she's withdrawing everything and taking her referrals with her. Other clients were asking similar questions, Mara reported. The institutional investors were particularly concerned about the leadership transition and the lack of transparency about my condition. Several had requested meetings with senior management to discuss the firm's strategic direction in my absence. Alaric is confident he can manage them, Mara said. He's scheduled a series of presentations for next month, designed to reassure clients about the firm's stability and future direction. He's going to present his liquidation plan as a strategic repositioning. Exactly. And if the clients buy it, he'll have their blessing to dismantle everything you built. That's when I knew it was time for ZL Hale to make her debut. Not as a vengeful mother seeking to expose her son's betrayal, but as a professional consultant hired to assess the firm's operations and recommend strategies for long-term success. Mara, I said, I think it's time for Larkhill Capital to hire some outside expertise. Securing a consulting contract with my own company proved surprisingly easy once I understood the psychology of men like my son. Alaric wanted validation from respected professionals, external confirmation that his leadership was legitimate and his strategies sound. When Gerald Sumner's law firm recommended ZL Hale as a consultant, with an impressive track record of stabilizing family-owned investment firms during leadership transitions, Alaric practically salivated at the opportunity. She comes highly recommended, Gerald told him during a carefully orchestrated phone call. Very discreet, very effective. She specializes in situations where sensitive family dynamics require careful management. The irony was delicious. Alaric was so eager to prove his competence to an outside expert that he never questioned why such an expert would be available on short notice, or why her fees were so reasonable, or why she insisted on working directly with junior staff rather than exclusively with senior management. My first day as ZL Hale at Larkhill Capital was surreal beyond description. I sat in the reception area of the offices I had designed, looking at portraits of myself that hung in the lobby like memorials to a dead founder, waiting to be introduced to employees I had hired and trained. The young woman at the reception desk, Sandra, whom I had promoted from intern to administrative coordinator just 2 years earlier, looked through me with the polite blankness reserved for outsiders. Miss Hale. Alaric emerged from what had been my office, his hand extended in greeting. Welcome to Larkhill Capital. I'm Alaric Larkhill, interim CEO. Interim CEO. The title he had awarded himself made my stomach clench, but I smiled with the professional warmth that Z.L. Hale had perfected. Mr. Larkhill, thank you for this opportunity. I've reviewed your materials, and I'm impressed by the firm's history. Yes, well, we're at a transitional moment. My mother built something remarkable here, but times change, markets evolve. Sometimes the strategies that worked in the past are inadequate for current challenges. He led me on a tour of offices that had once felt like home, but now seemed like a museum of my former life. The layout was unchanged, but the energy was different. Conversation stopped when Alaric appeared, and I could see the careful deference of employees who were still learning the new rules of engagement. This is our research department, he said, gesturing toward a cluster of desks where 3 analysts bent over computer screens displaying market data. Excellent team, though they sometimes get bogged down in overly conservative analysis. We're working on encouraging more aggressive growth strategies. Conservative analysis had been the foundation of our investment philosophy. I had built Larkhill Capital's reputation on thorough research, careful risk assessment, and strategies designed to preserve capital while generating steady returns. Alaric's aggressive growth strategies sounded like the kind of speculation that had destroyed his own ventures. And this, he continued, opening the door to a conference room where I had conducted countless client meetings, is where we'll be presenting our new strategic direction to key clients next week. I think you'll find our approach quite innovative. The presentation materials spread across the conference table told the story of my company's planned destruction with corporate buzzwords and colourful charts. Portfolio optimization through asset reallocation. Streamlined operations focused on high-yield opportunities. Modernized client services leveraging digital platforms. Each euphemism represented the dismantling of relationships and strategies that had taken decades to build. The asset reallocation meant selling off the carefully selected real estate investments that provided stable income for our retirees. The streamlined operations meant eliminating the personal service that had distinguished us from larger firms. The digital platforms meant replacing the face-to-face relationships that had been our greatest strength. Impressive, I said, because Z.L. Hale would recognize sophisticated financial planning even if she might have philosophical differences with its execution. You've clearly put considerable thought into this transition. My mother was brilliant for her time, Alaric said, his tone suggesting that her time was long past. But she was ultimately focused on preserving the past, rather than embracing the future. Sometimes you have to destroy the old to build something better. I wanted to remind him that the old had provided him with every opportunity he had ever received, every education he had completed, every failure he had been allowed to survive. Instead, I nodded thoughtfully. Change can certainly be challenging, especially in family businesses where emotional attachments to legacy approaches can complicate strategic decision-making. Exactly. Alaric's enthusiasm was genuine, and I realized he was starved for professional validation from someone he perceived as his peer. It's refreshing to work with someone who understands that sentiment can't drive business decisions. Over the following weeks, I embedded myself in the daily operations of Larkhill Capital with the systematic thoroughness that had built the company in the first place. I attended staff meetings, reviewed client files, and analysed financial reports with the careful attention of someone being paid to identify problems and recommend solutions. What I found was both encouraging and alarming. The core business was fundamentally sound. Our investment strategies were performing well. Our client base remained loyal, and our operational efficiency was among the best in the industry. But Alaric's improvements were creating cracks in the foundation that would eventually bring down the entire structure. He had hired 3 new senior staff members, all of them refugees from larger firms who had been let go for reasons that weren't entirely clear. They brought with them a culture of aggressive sales tactics and short-term thinking that was already beginning to alienate our more conservative clients. We need to push higher risk, higher reward options, I overheard one of them telling Tessa. Marin, a brilliant young analyst who had been with the firm for 3 years. These old folks are sitting on money they'll never spend. We should be helping them maximize returns instead of playing it safe. Tessa's response was measured but firm. Our clients trust us because we've consistently protected their principal while generating reasonable returns. They're not looking for maximum risk, they're looking for security and peace of mind. That's old school thinking. Tessa, times have changed. I made a note to speak with Tessa privately. She represented the next generation of leadership at Larkhill Capital, someone who understood our values while bringing fresh perspectives to traditional approaches. If I was going to save the company, I would need allies among the staff who remembered what we stood for. The opportunity came when I was reviewing client files in the small conference room that had been designated as my temporary office. Tessa knocked on the door frame, holding a stack of reports. Miss Hale, I have the quarterly performance analysis you requested. Come in, please. And closed the door. She handed me the reports and took a seat across from the small table, her expression carefully professional, but her body language suggesting someone with significant concerns she wasn't sure she could voice. These numbers are excellent, I said, reviewing her analysis. Your methodology is sophisticated, and your conclusions are well supported by the data. Thank you. I'm curious about something, though. You've been here for 3 years, correct? What's your assessment of the changes that have been implemented since Mrs. Larkhill's absence? Tessa was quiet for a moment, clearly weighing how much truth she could afford to share with an outside consultant. May I speak frankly? Please do. I'm concerned that we're losing sight of what made this firm successful. Mrs. Larkhill built her reputation on understanding that our clients weren't just account numbers, they were people with specific needs, specific fears, specific goals. The new management seems more focused on maximizing revenue per client than on providing the kind of personalized service that built our client base. Can you give me a specific example? Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez. She's been with the firm for 40 years, since before I was born. Her portfolio is worth over $2 million, and she's never questioned a single recommendation because she trusts. Trusted Mrs. Larkhill completely. Last month, one of the new senior associates suggested she move 70% of her holdings into high-growth tech stocks. When she asked why, he told her she was being too conservative for someone with her wealth. I kept my expression neutral, but inside I was furious. Mrs. Vasquez was 97 years old. She needed stability and income, not the volatility of speculative investments. What was her response? She asked to speak with Mrs. Larkhill directly. When they told her that wasn't possible, she threatened to take her money elsewhere. Mr. Larkhill had to personally intervene to convince her to stay. And how did he do that? Tessa's discomfort was obvious. He implied that Mrs. Larkhill's judgment had been compromised by her stroke, that the conservative strategies she had recommended were based on outdated thinking rather than Mrs. Vasquez's best interests. The betrayal cut deeper than I had expected. Alaric wasn't just stealing my company, he was rewriting history too. Suggest that my judgment had been flawed, that my clients had been poorly served by the approaches that had made them wealthy and secure. "Tessa," I said carefully, "what would you say if I told you that Mrs. Larkhill's investment strategies were not only sound, but significantly more sophisticated than what's being implemented now?" She looked at me with the sharp attention of someone who had been hoping for exactly this conversation. "I'd say that someone with your reputation and experience would know better than anyone what constitutes sound investment strategy." It was a careful answer, neither confirming nor denying my assessment, but suggesting that she was ready to hear more. "I'd also say," she continued, "that I've been wondering why someone of your caliber would take a consulting contract with a mid-sized firm in transition rather than working with the major institutions that could better afford your fees." Smart girl, she was asking without asking whether there was more to my presence than a routine consulting engagement. "Sometimes," I said, "the most interesting challenges come from unexpected places. And sometimes helping one firm get back on track is more satisfying than helping a large institution become slightly more profitable. Are we getting back on track?" "That depends. Are there other people here who share your concerns about the direction of the firm?" "Most of the staff who work directly with Mrs. Larkhill. We all feel like we're being asked to abandon everything that made this place special. Would you be interested in helping me develop some alternative recommendations for Mr. Larkhill's consideration?" The smile that crossed her face was answer enough. "What did you have in mind?" The phone call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in November, exactly 8 months after my stroke. I was in my Virginia Highland apartment, reviewing client portfolios as ZL Hale and preparing for another day of careful observation at Larkhill Capital, when Mara called with news that made me spill coffee across my meticulously organized desk. "He's broke," she said without preamble. "Completely, utterly, catastrophically broke, Alaric. Apparently, he's been funding his lifestyle and his management buyout attempt with leveraged investments that went sideways. The condo in Buckhead is in foreclosure, his credit cards are maxed out. And get this, he owes the IRS enough money to put him in federal prison." I sat back in my chair, trying to process this information. Alaric had always been financially reckless, but I had assumed that his control over my assets would provide him with enough cushion to maintain his lifestyle while he systematically dismantled my company. How bad is it? "Bad enough that he can't afford to keep paying for your care at Magnolia Manor." Patricia called this morning to inform him that his account is 60 days overdue, and they'll need payment immediately or they'll have to transfer you to a state facility. The irony was breathtaking. Alaric had imprisoned me in luxury to justify stealing my money, but he had stolen so incompetently that he could no longer afford the prison. What's his plan? That's where it gets interesting. He's scheduled an emergency meeting with the board of directors for Friday. According to my sources, he's going to request immediate authorization to liquidate the company's real estate portfolio to cover escalating care costs for his mother. I felt a familiar surge of fury, but this time it was tempered by something else: anticipation. Alaric was about to overplay his hand, and when he did, he would create the opening I needed to destroy his credibility completely. How much is he asking for? $15 million. He's claiming that your condition has deteriorated significantly and that you require specialized care that isn't covered by insurance. $15 million would represent nearly a third of the company's liquid assets. No responsible board would authorize such a massive expenditure without independent verification of the medical necessity. Which meant ... he's going to need supporting documentation from Dr. Whitman, already arranged. The meeting packet includes updated medical reports showing rapid cognitive decline and recommendations for immediate transfer to a specialized memory care facility that costs $30,000 a month. I almost admired the audacity of it. Alaric had created a fictional medical crisis to justify real financial theft. counting on the board's reluctance to question medical decisions and their sentimental attachment to their founder's welfare. But there was one thing he hadn't counted on. Z.L. Hale would be attending that board meeting as an invited consultant, and she would have some very specific questions about financial oversight and fiduciary responsibility. The emergency board meeting was held in a large conference room on the top floor of our building, the same room where I had hosted celebrations of major client acquisitions and strategic partnerships throughout the 1990s and 2000s, sitting at that polished oak table as Z.L. Hale. Watching Alaric present his case for liquidating my assets to pay for fictional medical care, I felt like I was watching my own murder being planned by committee, the board members, 5 distinguished professionals who had provided strategic guidance to Larkhill Capital for years, listened with the grave attention that such a serious request deserved. Dr. Margaret Chen, a retired professor of economics from Emory, James Patterson, a former bank president who had become a close friend over the decades of professional collaboration, Sarah Williams, a successful real estate developer who had joined the board in 2018, Robert Hayes, a tax attorney who specialized in estate planning, and Thomas Morrison, a recently retired investment advisor who had been added to the board just 3 months earlier at Alaric's suggestion. The medical reports are quite clear, Alaric was saying, his presentation polished and professional. My mother's condition has deteriorated significantly faster than anyone anticipated. The current facility is no longer equipped to provide the level of care she requires. Dr. Chen studied the medical reports with the critical eye of someone accustomed to evaluating research data. These recommendations are quite aggressive. Mr. Larkhill, has the family considered seeking a second opinion? Dr. Whitman is one of the most respected geriatric specialists in the Southeast, Alaric replied smoothly. My mother's original physicians have concurred with his assessment. It was a lie, but a lie that would be difficult to disprove without access to my actual medical records. Dr. Peterson at Magnolia Manor had noted my remarkable recovery, but her observations wouldn't be included in the documentation Alaric was presenting. The financial request is substantial, James Patterson observed. $15 million represents a significant portion of the firm's available assets. I understand that, Alaric said, but my mother founded this company. She deserves the best possible care, regardless of cost. The sentiment was perfectly pitched, filial devotion mixed with respect for my legacy. But I could see the discomfort on several board members' faces. They knew me well enough to know that I would never want the company I built to be financially compromised for my personal care, especially not to this extent. Mr. Larkhill, I interjected in Z.L. Hale's carefully modulated voice. May I ask a few questions about the financial projections? Of course, Miss Hale. According to these documents, the ongoing care costs are projected at $30,000 per month indefinitely. That's $360,000 per year, which suggests the $15 million would be depleted in roughly 40 years. Given actuarial tables for women in their 70s, even those with significant medical needs, this seems like a substantial overestimate. Have alternative care scenarios been explored? Alaric's confidence faltered slightly. We're planning for the worst-case scenario. It's better to be over-prepared than to find ourselves unable to provide adequate care, certainly, but fiduciary responsibility requires that we balance family needs with business sustainability. Have you considered establishing a structured care fund that would provide for your mother's needs without requiring immediate liquidation of long-term assets? The medical team has been quite specific about the urgency, of course, but surely a phased approach would be more prudent, perhaps liquidating $2 or $3 million initially, with additional funds available as needed based on actual costs rather than projections. I could see the panic beginning to build behind Alaric's professional composure. A phased approach would provide enough money to cover legitimate medical expenses, but not enough to solve his personal financial crisis. More importantly, it would require ongoing board oversight and regular reporting, making it much harder for him to misappropriate funds. Miss Hale raises excellent points, Dr. Chen said. Perhaps we should table this discussion until we can review alternative financial structures. I'm afraid that's not possible, Alaric said, his voice taking on a harder edge. The medical situation requires immediate action. Delay could be dangerous for my mother. The emotional manipulation was obvious, and I could see several board members bristling at the implied pressure. These were sophisticated professionals who didn't appreciate being rushed into major financial decisions. Mr. Larkhill, Sarah Williams said firmly, we all want what's best for your mother, but a $15 million expenditure requires due diligence. We need time to review the medical documentation, explore alternative care options, and develop a sustainable financial plan. I'm afraid time is something we don't have. That's when I decided to deploy the nuclear option. Mr. Larkhill, given the urgency you've described, perhaps it would be helpful to have direct communication with your mother's medical team. I'd be happy to arrange a conference call with Dr. Whitman to discuss the treatment plan in detail. The colour drained from Alaric's face. That won't be necessary. The documentation speaks for itself. I'm sure it does, but as a consultant, I've found that direct communication with medical professionals often reveals nuances that aren't captured in written reports. Particularly regarding timeline and treatment alternatives, I could see him calculating rapidly, trying to determine whether Dr. Whitman could be trusted to maintain the fiction under direct questioning from sophisticated financial professionals. Apparently, he decided the risk was too great. Dr. Whitman is extremely busy, he said. His schedule wouldn't accommodate a Mr. Larkhill. James Patterson interrupted. If the medical situation is as urgent as you've indicated, I would think Dr. Whitman would make time to discuss his patient's needs with the people responsible for funding her care. The trap was closing, and Alaric knew it. His carefully constructed narrative was beginning to unravel under the weight of reasonable questions and professional scrutiny. Perhaps, I suggested helpfully, we could also arrange for an independent medical evaluation, just to ensure that all options have been explored before committing to such an expensive treatment plan. That won't be necessary, Alaric said quickly. Too quickly, the silence that followed was pregnant with suspicion. Board members exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their growing concerns regarding both the medical situation and Alaric's financial management. I think, Dr. Chen said finally, that we need more information before making any decisions about asset liquidation. Mr. Larkhill will need complete medical records, not just Dr. Whitman's reports. We'll also need detailed cost breakdowns for the proposed treatment plan and evidence that less expensive alternatives have been thoroughly explored. And, James Patterson added, we'll need to see current financial statements for both the company and any personal accounts related to Mrs. Larkhill's care. We have a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that company assets are being used appropriately. I watched Alaric's face as the weight of their demands sank in. Complete medical records would reveal the fraud. Personal financial statements would expose his bankruptcy. He was trapped between the lie he had constructed and the truth he couldn't afford to reveal. I'll need some time to gather that information, he said. Of course, Sarah Williams said. Shall we reconvene in 2 weeks or 2 weeks? Enough time for a desperate man to make desperate choices. Enough time for the son who had betrayed me to reveal the full extent of his desperation. As the board members filed out of the conference room, discussing their concerns in hushed tones, I remained behind to organize my notes. Alaric approached me with the careful smile of someone trying to maintain professional relationships while his world collapsed around him. Miss Hale, he said. I appreciate your thoroughness, but I hope you understand that sometimes family situations require more flexibility than standard business practices might suggest. Of course, Mr. Larkhill, family considerations are always important. But I've found that the best way to help family members is to ensure that financial decisions are sustainable over the long term. Yes, well, sometimes the long term has to take a backseat to immediate needs. I looked at him directly, letting Z.L. Holle's professional mask slip just enough to reveal the steel underneath. Mr. Larkhill, in my experience, people who sacrifice long-term stability for short-term solutions usually end up with neither. Something in my tone must have triggered a memory, because for just a moment, his eyes narrowed as if he were trying to place a familiar voice in an unfamiliar context. But the moment passed, and he nodded with the forced courtesy of someone who no longer trusted his own instincts. Thank you for your input, Miss Hale. I'll be in touch. As I watched him leave, I realized that the game had fundamentally changed. Alaric was no longer operating from a position of strength, carefully executing a long-term plan to steal my legacy. He was cornered, desperate, and facing the kind of financial pressure that could make even basically honest people do terrible things, and desperate people, as I had learned during my years in business, were capable of anything. The week following the board meeting was when everything began to accelerate toward an inevitable collision. Alaric's desperation had reached the point where subtlety was no longer possible, and his increasingly frantic attempts to salvage his situation created the opening I had been waiting for to reveal the truth about his betrayal. It started with a phone call to Magnolia Manor. I was working in my apartment, reviewing quarterly reports for Z.L. Holle's upcoming presentation to the board, when Deborah Charles called my cell phone with news that made my blood run cold. Mrs. Larkhill, she said, her voice tight with concern. I think you need to know what happened here yesterday. What is it? Your son came to the facility with some kind of medical transport team. They said they had orders to transfer you to a specialized memory care unit in South Georgia. When we told them you weren't here, that you were still undergoing testing at Emory, he became agitated. Agitated was almost certainly an understatement. Alaric must have been counting on my physical presence at Magnolia Manor to support his fiction about my deteriorating condition. My continued absence meant that any board member who decided to verify his claims would discover that the patient requiring $15 million in specialized care had essentially vanished. What kind of transport team? That's what worried me. They didn't have proper medical credentials, and their paperwork looked unofficial. When I asked to speak with the attending physician who had ordered the transfer, they said Dr. Whitman was too busy to take calls. What did you tell them? I told them that any patient transfer would require authorization from Dr. Peter's son, and that she was in surgery until this afternoon. They left pretty quickly after that. I felt a chill of recognition. Alaric was moving beyond financial fraud into something much more dangerous: attempted kidnapping. If he could physically relocate me to a facility where he had more control, he could maintain his fiction long enough to extract the money he needed. Deborah, I need you to do something for me. If anyone else comes looking for me, don't give them any information. Don't confirm that I'm missing. Don't speculate about where I might be. Don't even acknowledge that you know me. Just say that patient information is confidential and refer them to hospital administration. Mrs. Larkhill, are you in some kind of trouble? I'm in the kind of trouble that happens when people underestimate old women, but I'm handling it, though. Next piece of the puzzle came from Mara, who had been monitoring Alaric's activities through our network of contacts in Atlanta's financial community. She called that afternoon with information that confirmed my worst fears about his desperation. He's been meeting with some very questionable people, she said without preamble. Gerald's investigator has photos of him with Marcus Vega, That loan shark who operates out of the strip clubs on Stewart Avenue. Marcus Vega was a name I recognized from newspaper stories about organized crime in Atlanta. He specialized in high interest loans to desperate businessmen, with collection methods that were rumored to involve much more than aggressive phone calls. How much does he owe, based on the surveillance? Probably more than he can pay without access to company assets. The investigator thinks he borrowed against expected inheritance, assuming he'd be able to liquidate your holdings before the loans came due. When are they due? End of next week, based on the timeline we've been able to piece together, which explain the urgency of his medical crisis and his increasingly reckless behavior. Alaric wasn't just stealing my company to fund his lifestyle, he was stealing it to avoid the kind of debt collectors who didn't accept installment plans. There's more, Mara continued. He's apparently been telling people that you're already dead. The words hit me like a physical blow. What? Gerald's sources say he's been shopping around for buyers for your art collection, claiming he's settling your estate. He told one gallery owner that you passed away peacefully last month, and that he's liquidating assets to pay estate taxes. I sat in stunned silence, trying to process the implications. Alaric wasn't just planning to steal my money, he was planning to erase me entirely. In his version of events, I would simply disappear. Another elderly woman who had died quietly in institutional care, while her devoted son handled the painful but necessary task of settling her affairs. Zeph? You still there? I'm here. I'm just processing. Gerald thinks we need to move fast. If Alaric starts liquidating assets based on fraudulent death certificates, it could take years to untangle the legal mess. Even after we prove you're alive, what's our timeline? Days, not weeks. Gerald's already filed preliminary injunctions to freeze major asset transfers, but they won't hold if Alaric can produce convincing death certificates and estate documentation. That evening, I called an emergency meeting with my small team of allies. We gathered in the back room of a restaurant in Decatur, far enough from downtown Atlanta to avoid accidental encounters with anyone from my former life. Gerald Sumner, Mara Klein, and Tessa Marin, the unlikely coalition that was helping me reclaim my identity and my company. The situation has escalated beyond financial fraud, Gerald said, spreading documents across the table like evidence in a criminal trial. Alaric is now attempting to legally establish your death, which would give him immediate access to all company assets as your heir. Tessa studied the forged death certificate that Gerald's investigator had obtained. This looks legitimate. How is he getting official documentation? Dr. Whitman, apparently, has connections with people who can produce any kind of medical paperwork for the right price. A death certificate is just another form of documentation in their business model. What about the board meeting next week? I asked. If he can't produce me for independent medical evaluation, won't that raise red flags? That's where it gets interesting, Mara said. According to my sources, he's not planning to attend the board meeting. He's going to claim that you died before the medical evaluation could be completed, making the whole discussion moot, and then present himself as the grieving son who needs to liquidate company assets to settle your estate. Gerald added, It's actually quite clever, if you don't mind committing multiple felonies in the process. I felt a familiar surge of admiration for Alaric's audacity, even as I recognized the necessity of stopping him completely. He had inherited my strategic thinking ability, but without the ethical framework that had guided my business decisions for 40 years. So what's our move? Tessa asked. We let him commit to his story, I said. Let him file the death certificate. Let him start the estate proceedings. Let him believe that he successfully erased me from my own life. Zeph, Mara said carefully, once he files that death certificate, you'll be legally dead. Your bank accounts will be frozen. Your identity will be compromised. Your ability to prove who you are will be seriously limited. Only if I'm trying to prove that I'm Zephyr Larkhill, I replied. But ZL Hale is very much alive, and she has a consulting contract that gives her access to all company records and operations. Gerald's eyes lit up with understanding. You want to let him kill you so you can investigate your own murder? More than that, I want to let him inherit my company so I can watch him try to run it. Because here's what Alaric has never understood about Larkhill Capital. It's not just a collection of assets that can be liquidated for cash. It's a network of relationships built over 40 years, and those relationships don't transfer automatically to the next generation. The clients will revolt, Tessa said. Exactly. Especially when they discover that their trusted advisor has been replaced by someone who sees them as account numbers rather than people. Alaric thinks he can step into my role and immediately command the respect I spent decades earning. He's about to learn that respect isn't inherited, and when he fails, ZL Hale will be perfectly positioned to help the board of directors understand what went wrong and how to fix it. Gerald was quiet for a moment, clearly working through the legal implications. It's risky, Zeph. If something goes wrong, if Alaric succeeds in liquidating the company before you can stop him, you'll have no legal recourse. Dead people can't file lawsuits. Gerald, I've been taking risks my entire life. I risked everything when I left the compound at 17. I risked everything when I started this company with no capital and no connections. I risked everything. When I married Richard, when I had Alaric, when I made every major decision that brought me to this point, I looked around the table at the three people who had chosen to help me fight for my life's work. The difference is that this time, I'm not risking everything to build something new. I'm risking everything to save something I've already built. And I'd rather lose fighting than surrender to someone who sees my legacy as his inheritance. Mara reached across the table and squeezed my hand. So what do you need from us? I need Gerald to make sure that when Alaric files the death certificate, ZL Hale's identity remains intact and her consulting contract remains valid. I need Mara to keep monitoring his activities and feeding me information about his plans. And I need Tessa to help me document everything that happens at the company over the next few weeks. What are you going to do? I'm going to attend my own funeral, I said. And then I'm going to watch my son try to fill shoes that were always too big for him. The plan was audacious, dangerous, and completely dependent on Alaric's arrogance overcoming his caution. But as I sat in that restaurant, surrounded by people who believed in me enough to risk their own reputations and careers, I felt more alive than I had since the morning I signed away my power of attorney. Zephyr Larkhill was about to die, but ZL Hale was just getting started. My own obituary appeared in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution on a grey Thursday morning in December, exactly 9 months after my stroke. I read it over coffee in my Virginia Highland apartment, marveling at how Alaric had managed to reduce 40 years of achievement to 3 paragraphs of corporate platitudes and family sentiments. Zephyr Larkhill, 72, founder and longtime CEO of Larkhill Capital, passed away peacefully on December 10 after a courageous battle with stroke-related complications. Mrs. Larkhill built her investment firm from a small office above a bookstore into one of Atlanta's most respected boutique financial services companies, managing over $200 million in client assets at the time of her death. The details were perfectly crafted to discourage further investigation. No mention of where I died, no funeral arrangements, no invitation for public mourning. Just the essential facts that would establish legal death, while minimizing opportunities for people to ask uncomfortable questions. She's survived by her son, Alaric Larkhill, who will continue her legacy of exceptional client service and innovative investment strategies. In lieu of flowers, the family requests donations to the American Stroke Association. Even in death, apparently, I was expected to support his narrative about being the natural heir to my reputation and relationships. The presumption was breathtaking, but it was also the kind of overconfidence that would make his eventual downfall more spectacular. The funeral was held at St. Philip's Cathedral, a choice that revealed how little Alaric actually knew about my preferences. I had attended services there occasionally for social reasons, but I had never been particularly religious, and the formal Episcopal ceremony felt like a performance designed to impress business contacts rather than honor life. I watched from the back of the cathedral, wearing a black dress and dark sunglasses that transforms El Hale into just another mourner paying respects to a prominent businesswoman. The attendance was respectable, but not overwhelming, maybe 60 people scattered among pews that could hold 300. Alaric had clearly hoped for a larger turnout that would reinforce his claim to inheriting my professional relationships along with my assets. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez was there, of course, sitting in the third row with the careful dignity of someone who had outlived most of her friends. At 97, she was probably the only person in attendance who remembered my early struggles, who had witnessed the transformation from desperate young mother to successful entrepreneur. Several times during the service, I saw her studying. Alaric with the sharp attention of someone evaluating a questionable investment. Mara sat near the middle of the church, her grief entirely genuine despite knowing the truth about my survival. She had lost her best friend and business partner, even if that friend was merely changing identities rather than actually dying. The tears on her face reminded me that disappearing from my own life had consequences for people who cared about me beyond my utility as a mother or business owner. The eulogy Alaric delivered was masterful in its manipulation of both facts and emotions. He spoke about my dedication to clients, my innovative approaches to wealth management, and my commitment to treating every investor with personal attention and respect. All of it was true, but coming from him, it felt like intellectual property theft rather than genuine remembrance. My mother taught me that success in business isn't about maximizing profits, he said, his voice carrying just the right note of bereaved determination. It's about maximizing trust. Every client who honored her with their confidence became part of our extended family, and I pledged to continue that tradition of personal service and fiduciary responsibility. I watched Mrs. Vasquez's face during this particular section and saw skepticism rather than comfort. She had met with Alaric multiple times since my supposed incapacitation, and his version of personal service had apparently failed to impress. Her Larkhill Capital will continue to grow and evolve, guided by the principles my mother established and the relationships she built. Her legacy isn't just in the company she founded, it's in the lives she touched and the trust she earned through 40 years of exceptional service. The words were perfect, but they were also promises that Alaric had no hope of keeping. Trust wasn't inherited, relationships weren't transferred through wills, and respect couldn't be claimed by association. He was about to learn that lesson in the most public and humiliating way possible. After the service, I lingered in the cathedral parking lot, watching the reception line where mourners offered condolences to my son. The conversations were brief and formal, lacking the warmth that genuine affection for the deceased would have generated. Most of the attendees were business contacts fulfilling social obligations rather than friends grieving a personal loss. Mrs. Vasquez's interaction with Alaric was particularly telling. I couldn't hear their conversation, but I could see her posture polite but reserved, the stance of someone withholding judgment until actions proved whether words had substance. When she turned away from him, her expression suggested that she remained unconvinced about his ability to fill my role. Over the following week, I watched my own death reverberate through the business community with the detached fascination of an anthropologist studying social rituals. The Atlanta Business Chronicle ran a retrospective article about my career, focusing on my role as a pioneering woman in finance and my reputation for ethical investment strategies. The Georgia Association of Investment Advisors issued a statement praising my contributions to the profession, but the most interesting reactions came from my clients, who began calling Larkhill Capital with questions that Alaric was unprepared to answer. Mrs. Vasquez requested an immediate meeting to review her portfolio. The Hendricks family, who had trusted me with their retirement savings for 15 years, wanted detailed explanations of recent investment decisions. Dr. and Mrs. Park, whose children's education funds I had managed since 1998, demanded reassurance that their conservative investment strategy would continue unchanged. As Z.L. Hale, I was perfectly positioned to observe Alaric's responses to these requests, and what I saw confirmed my worst fears about his understanding of client relationships. He approached each meeting as a sales opportunity rather than a service commitment, trying to convince long-term clients that they needed more aggressive investment strategies rather than listening to their concerns about stability and risk management. Mrs. Vasquez, I overheard him saying during a meeting in what had been my office, "You're being too conservative with your investments. At your age, you should be focused on maximizing growth rather than preserving capital." The silence that followed suggested that Mrs. Vasquez was not receptive to being told how to manage money by someone young enough to be her great-grandson. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the kind of steel that had helped her survive 97 years of economic uncertainty. "Young man," she said, "I was investing money before you were born. Your mother understood that my primary concern isn't maximizing growth, it's ensuring that I never have to depend on anyone else for my financial security. If you can appreciate that distinction, then perhaps it's time for me to find an advisor who can." Mrs. Vasquez, please don't misunderstand. I'm simply suggesting that your portfolio could benefit from some modernization. Her voice rose slightly, and I could imagine the expression that accompanied it. "Mr. Larkhill, your mother took my $5,000 in 1983 and turned it into over $2 million by listening to what I needed rather than telling me what I should want. If you think you can improve on that track record by convincing me to gamble with my security, you are sadly mistaken." I heard the sound of a chair being pushed back from the desk. "I'll be back next week to discuss transferring my accounts. Please have all the necessary paperwork prepared." Mrs. Vasquez's departure from the office was the first domino in what would become an avalanche of client defections. Word spread quickly through Atlanta's tight-knit community of wealthy retirees that Alaric Larkhill was trying to convince long-time clients to abandon the conservative strategies that had served them well for decades. The Hendricks family was next. During their meeting, Alaric suggested moving their retirement funds into cryptocurrency investments, apparently unaware that James Hendricks was a retired banker who understood exactly how risky such investments were for people approaching retirement age. "Son," Mr. Hendricks said with the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to a child, "your mother spent 15 years earning our trust by never suggesting investments that could jeopardize our ability to retire comfortably. The fact that you're recommending cryptocurrency to a 70-year-old retiree tells me everything I need to know about your understanding of fiduciary responsibility." By the end of the second week after my funeral, Larkhill Capital had lost over $30 million in client assets, representing nearly 15% of our total portfolio. The exodus was led by the oldest and most loyal clients, the people who had built the firm's reputation through their referrals and their unwavering trust in my judgment. The board of directors called an emergency meeting for the following Friday, ostensibly to discuss client retention strategies, but actually to address the growing concern that Alaric was destroying the company he had inherited. As C.L. Hale, I was invited to provide consulting recommendations for stabilizing the firm during its difficult transition period. The meeting was held in the same conference room where Alaric had tried to steal $15 million just 3 weeks earlier. But the dynamic was completely different. Instead of a grieving son requesting support for his mother's medical care, we now had a failing CEO trying to explain why his inherited company was hemorrhaging clients and revenue. The market transition is always challenging, Alaric said. His confidence noticeably diminished since the funeral. Some clients are naturally resistant to change, especially older investors who may not understand the benefits of more aggressive growth strategies. Dr. Margaret Chen studied the client retention reports with the same critical attention she had once applied to academic research. Mr. Larkhill, these aren't random market fluctuations. We're looking at targeted departures by your mother's longer-standing and most profitable clients. People who trusted Larkhill Capital for decades are leaving within weeks of your assuming control, which suggests, James Patterson added, that the problem isn't market conditions or client resistance to change. The problem is that you're fundamentally misunderstanding what these clients valued about their relationship with your mother. I'm implementing the same principles she taught me, Alaric insisted, but his voice carried the defensive tone of someone who knew his explanation wasn't convincing anyone. Are you? I interjected as ZL Hale, because from my observations, your mother built her reputation on understanding each client's individual needs and risk tolerance. She provided personalized service based on careful analysis of their specific situations. You seem to be applying one-size-fits-all solutions that prioritize revenue generation over client satisfaction. Miss Hale, with all due respect, you didn't know my mother personally. I lived with her principles my entire life. The irony of that statement was almost too much to bear. Alaric had indeed lived with my principles his entire life. He had simply chosen to reject them in favor of shortcuts and quick profits. You're right, I said. I didn't know your mother personally, but I've spent 2 months studying this company, and I can tell you that the clients who are leaving aren't doing so because they're resistant to change. They're leaving because they don't trust you to protect their interests the way she did. That's ridiculous. I have exactly the same training as Mr. Larkhill, Sarah Williams interrupted. Training and trust are not the same thing. Your mother earned client loyalty through 40 years of consistent performance and personal attention. You seem to expect that loyalty to transfer automatically based on your family relationship. The numbers don't lie, Robert Hayes added, pointing to the financial reports. Client satisfaction is down, account performance is down, and referrals have essentially stopped. Whatever you're doing differently from your mother, it's not working. I watched Alaric's face as the weight of their criticism settled over him. For the first time since my stroke, he was being held accountable by people whose opinions mattered, people who couldn't be manipulated or intimidated. What do you recommend? Dr. Chen asked, addressing the question to me rather than to Alaric. I recommend that the board consider whether Mr. Larkhill has the experience and temperament necessary to lead this firm through its current challenges. Client retention requires more than good intentions, it requires demonstrated competence and genuine commitment to fiduciary responsibility. Are you suggesting we replace him? I'm suggesting that you evaluate his performance objectively, the same way you would evaluate any executive whose decisions were costing the company millions of dollars in lost revenue. The silence that followed was thick with implication. For the first time since my stroke, the board was seriously questioning Alaric's fitness to lead the company he had inherited through medical manipulation and legal fraud. Perhaps, Thomas Morrison suggested, we should consider bringing in additional management expertise to support Mr. Larkhill during this transition period. What kind of management expertise? Alaric asked, his voice tight with suspicion. Someone with extensive experience in client relationship management, I said. Someone who understands the culture your mother built and can help restore client Confidence, someone like you, Miss Hale. If the board believes that would be helpful. I could see Alaric calculating the implications, trying to determine whether accepting additional oversight was better or worse than risking further board intervention. His desperation was palpable, and I realized that he was finally beginning to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation. I think, Dr. Chen said, that we should table this discussion for 1 week while Mr. Larkhill considers how he wants to proceed. Either he can accept additional management support, or we can explore other options for leadership transition. As the board members filed out of the conference room, I remained behind to gather my materials. Alaric approached me with the forced smile of someone trying to negotiate from a position of weakness. Miss Hale, he said, I hope you understand that this is a family business. My mother built it, and I inherited it. No amount of consulting expertise can replace the personal connection I have to this company. I looked at him directly, letting him see something in ZL Holle's eyes that might have reminded him of someone else, someone who had never tolerated excuses or accepted failure as inevitable. Mr. Larkhill, I said, your mother built this company by earning the respect of every client, every employee, and every business partner she worked with. You inherited her assets, but you haven't inherited her reputation. That has to be earned all over again, and if I can't earn it, then you'll lose everything she built, and you'll have no one to blame but yourself. For just a moment, I thought I saw recognition flicker in his eyes, not of ZL Holle's identity, but of the tone, the directness, the refusal to accept anything less than excellence that had defined my approach to business for 40 years. But the moment passed, and he nodded with the hollow courtesy of someone who had run out of options. I'll be in touch, Miss Hale. As I watched him leave, I realized that the climax I had been building toward wasn't going to be a dramatic revelation or a satisfying confrontation. It was going to be something much more powerful: the slow, inevitable collapse of everything Alaric had tried to steal, destroyed not by external enemies, but by his own incompetence and the weight of expectations he could never meet. Zephyra Larkhill was dead, but her company was about to be reborn, and her son was about to learn the difference between inheriting wealth and earning respect. 6 months after my own funeral, I sat in the office that had been mine for over 3 decades, looking out at the Atlanta skyline from behind a desk that bore a new nameplate, ZL Hale, Chief Executive Officer. The transition had been completed with the kind of legal precision that only Gerald Sumner could orchestrate, and the irony was so perfect it felt like poetry. Alaric had lost control of Larkhill Capital not through any dramatic revelation of his fraud, but through the simple arithmetic of business failure. By March, the company had lost 60% of its client base and was hemorrhaging money faster than even his desperation could compensate for. The board of directors had no choice but to remove him as CEO and install someone with the experience necessary to save what remained of my life's work. The fact that this someone happened to be the mysterious consultant who had been documenting his failures for months was simply good fortune from their perspective. They had no idea they were hiring a dead woman to replace her living son. The paperwork is complete, Gerald told me as he placed the final documents on my desk. ZL Hale now has full legal authority to operate Larkhill Capital, make all strategic decisions, and rebuild the client relationships that were damaged during the transition period. What about Alaric, unemployed, bankrupt, and facing potential criminal charges related to the fraudulent death certificate? Marcus Beger's collection methods have apparently become quite persuasive. I felt no satisfaction in my son's downfall, only the weary sadness that comes from watching someone destroy themselves through their own choices. Alaric had been given every advantage, every opportunity to build something meaningful with the foundation I had provided. Instead, he had chosen to gamble with other people's trust and lost everything. Has he figured out who I am? I don't think so. He's too focused on his own problems to pay attention to anyone else's success. Besides, from his perspective, his mother is dead and buried. The idea that she could have engineered his replacement would be too psychologically threatening too. Except, the restoration of Larkhill Capital required more than just new leadership. It required rebuilding relationships that had been damaged by months of incompetent management. My first priority was reaching out to the clients who had left, not as Zephyr Larkhill's successor, but as someone who understood and respected the principles that had originally attracted them to the firm. Mrs. Eleanor Vasquez was my first appointment, and I approached the meeting with the nervousness of someone whose entire future depended on a 97-year-old woman's assessment of her character. She arrived at my office with the careful dignity that had impressed me 40 years earlier, her eyes still sharp enough to evaluate investments and people with equal precision. "Miss Hale," she said, as she settled into the chair across from my desk, "I've been hearing interesting things about you." "What kind of things?" "That you understand the difference between managing money and serving clients. That you believe investment advice should be based on individual needs rather than generic market theories. That you actually listen to what people tell you about their goals and concerns." I try to. Alaric Larkhill tried to convince me to put 70% of my portfolio into technology stocks. When I asked him why a 97-year-old woman would want such a risky investment strategy, he told me I was being too conservative for someone with my wealth. She paused, studying my face with the kind of attention that missed nothing. Zephyr Larkhill would have understood that my wealth is meaningless if I can't sleep at night, knowing it's secure. She would have known that my primary goal isn't maximizing returns, it's ensuring that I never have to depend on anyone else for my financial security. "Mrs. Vasquez," I said carefully, "what would you say if I told you that I share that philosophy completely, that I believe investment advice should be based on what clients need to feel secure rather than what advisors think they should want?" I'd say you sound like someone worth trusting. But trust has to be earned, not promised. Then let me earn it. Over the following months, I rebuilt Larkhill Capital one client relationship at a time. The Hendricks family returned after I demonstrated that their retirement planning didn't require cryptocurrency investments. Dr. and Mrs. Park renewed their confidence when I showed them how their children's education funds could grow steadily without exposing them to unnecessary risk. Each conversation required me to prove that Z.L. Hale understood the principles that had made Zephyr Larkhill successful, without ever acknowledging that they were the same person. It was the most challenging performance of my life, but also the most satisfying. I was earning recognition for my abilities rather than trading on my reputation. The staff integration was equally delicate. Tessa Merrin became my unofficial liaison to employees who had worked under my original leadership, helping them understand that the new CEO shared their commitment to client service over profit maximization. She also served as my early warning system for any signs that Alaric might be becoming suspicious about Z.L. Hale's remarkable familiarity with company history and culture. "The transition is going better than anyone expected," she told me during one of our weekly strategy meetings. "Client retention is back up to 80%, and we're getting referrals again." "What about employee morale?" "Honestly, better than it's been since before your since before Mrs. Larkhill's stroke. People feel like they're working for someone who values their contributions rather than someone who sees them as obstacles to profit." The most difficult aspect of my resurrection was managing the relationship with Mara, who struggled with the cognitive dissonance of mourning her best friend while working with her replacement. We had agreed that she would return to the firm as Chief Financial Officer, but the emotional complexity of our professional collaboration required careful navigation. "Sometimes I forget," she told me one afternoon as we reviewed quarterly reports in my office. I'll start to make a reference to something Zephyra and I experienced together, and then I remember that I'm supposed to be talking to Z.L. Hale. How are you handling that? By remembering that the most important thing isn't my comfort, it's saving what she built? If keeping her legacy alive requires some psychological adjustment on my part, that's a small price to pay. The media attention surrounding Larkhill Capital's recovery was gratifying in ways I hadn't anticipated. The Atlanta Business Chronicle ran a feature story about Z.L. Holle's successful turnaround of a struggling family business, praising her intuitive understanding of client needs and her commitment to the personal service philosophy that built the firm's original reputation. The article included a quote that made me smile. Ms. Hale seems to have absorbed the best qualities of Larkhill Capital's founder while bringing fresh perspectives to traditional investment strategies. It's almost as if Zephyra Larkhill's spirit lives on in her successor's approach to client relationships. If only they knew how literal that assessment was. The final resolution came in December, exactly 1 year after my official death. Alaric made one last desperate attempt to reclaim what he still considered his inheritance, filing a lawsuit that challenged Z.L. Holle's authority to manage his mother's company. The legal argument was based on his claim that no outsider, regardless of competence, should control a family business that rightfully belonged to him as Zephyra Larkhill's heir. Gerald's response was masterful in its simplicity. He demonstrated that Alaric had voluntarily relinquished control through his failure to meet basic fiduciary responsibilities, that the board of directors had acted within their legal authority to replace him, and that Z.L. Holle's management had restored the company to profitability while Alaric's leadership had nearly destroyed it. The judge's ruling was brief and decisive. Mr. Larkhill's claim to inherit his mother's business fails to acknowledge that inheritance requires more than genetic relationship, it requires competence. The evidence clearly shows that Miss Hale has demonstrated the management skills necessary to preserve and grow the firm's assets. While Mr. Larkhill's brief tenure resulted in significant financial losses, the court finds no basis for overturning the board's decision. That evening, I called Mrs. Vasquez to share the news that Larkhill Capital's future was secure. Her response was characteristically direct. "Miss Hale," she said, "I've been investing money for 60 years, and I've learned that the most important quality in a financial advisor isn't intelligence or education or even experience. It's integrity. You've shown me that you have integrity, and that's worth more than any family connection. Thank you, Mrs. Vasquez. That means more to me than you could know. I have one question for you, though." My heart skipped a beat. "What's that? When are you going to tell me who you really are?" The silence stretched between us for what felt like hours. Finally, I found my voice. "What makes you think I'm anyone other than Z.L. Hale?" "Because," she said with the gentle humor of someone who had seen everything twice, "I've been working with investment advisors for 40 years, and I've never met anyone who understood my needs as completely as Zephyra Larkhill did, until now. Mrs. Vasquez, don't worry, dear. Your secret is safe with me. But I want you to know that whatever game you've been playing, whatever reasons you had for disappearing and coming back under a different name, I think you've earned the right to be whoever you want to be." After I hung up the phone, I sat in my office looking out at the city where I'd built my life, lost my identity, and reclaimed my purpose. The woman in the mirror was Z.L. Hale now, but she carried within her all the experiences, relationships, and hard-won wisdom of Zephyra Larkhill. I had proven that respect couldn't be inherited, that trust had to be earned, and that competence mattered more than connections. I had also learned that sometimes the only way to save what you've built is to let it go completely and then fight to earn it back on your own terms. Alaric would have to find his own way now, without the safety net of my money or the burden of my expectations. Perhaps failure would teach him the lessons that success never could. Perhaps he would eventually understand that legacy isn't something you inherit, it's something you create through your own choices and actions. As for me, I had everything I needed: meaningful work, relationships built on mutual respect, and the satisfaction that comes from proving that a woman's value doesn't diminish with age, it just becomes more refined, more focused, more dangerous to anyone who underestimates it. The nameplate on my desk read Larkhill, but the company was still Larkhill Capital, and the principles that guided it were still mine. Sometimes the best revenge isn't defeating your enemies, it's becoming so successful that your enemies become irrelevant. I opened my laptop and began drafting the quarterly report that would show another period of record growth, record client satisfaction, and record employee retention. At the bottom of the document, I added a small note that only a few people would understand, in memory of Zephyr Larkhill, who taught us that true leadership is measured not by what you accumulate, but by what you leave behind. The sun was setting over Atlanta, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that reminded me of all the sunsets I had watched from this same window over the past few decades. I was 73 years old, officially dead, and more alive than I had felt in years. Tomorrow, I would continue building the legacy that no one could steal because it lived not in bank accounts or legal documents, but in the relationships I had earned and the trust I had proven worthy of receiving. Zephyr Larkhill was gone, but her work would continue forever. I stood outside the boardroom window, watching Alaric cross Peachtree Street, clutching a manila folder he had no idea was obsolete. He still came in most mornings, wearing that same self-assured look he had inherited from his father, never realizing that confidence without competence is a bankruptcy waiting for a signature. He was an employee. Now, not an executive, not an heir, just another salaried professional under performance review. After the board ousted him as CEO, they offered him a modest position in business development, partly to save face, mostly to keep him from suing. I approved it, quietly, anonymously. The irony of it was too elegant to resist. Each time he walks past me, Larkhill, the turnaround consultant who now signs his paychecks, I feel nothing but a quiet, clean sense of justice. He doesn't know who I am, he doesn't suspect. But he's learning, painfully and slowly, what leadership really looks like. And perhaps that is the most fitting punishment of all, being forced to live inside the machine he tried to steal. Now rebuilt to run on values he never learned to respect. Mara once asked me if I'd ever tell him the truth. Wouldn't it be satisfying, she said, to see his face? But I've already seen it at the board meeting, in the aftermath, when the walls caved in. I watched him discover that money can't resurrect respect, that lineage means nothing when trust is gone, and that you can inherit an empire and still be exiled from its soul. And besides, some truths work better as ghosts than confessions. These days, Larkhill Capital is quieter, leaner, more focused. I let the company shrink by design, not out of defeat, but rebirth. We're boutique again, just like when it started. Every new client relationship is intentional, every hire handpicked. Every dollar guided by empathy as much as strategy. My office still overlooks the Caldwell skyline, but the desk is different now, modern, matte oak, no longer the imposing slab of mahogany that once intimidated interns. A small placard reads Larkhill, not Zephyr Larkhill. Clients know me by this name, employees respect me under it. My legacy, finally, is my own, and yes, Alaric still works here. He's no longer reckless, not because he's reformed, but because he's afraid. Fear isn't ideal leadership, but it's a start. He hasn't spoken my real name in over a year. I suspect that deep down, he wonders what happened to the woman who built the empire he tried to liquidate. Maybe he lies awake sometimes, trying to remember the tone of my voice or the weight of my gaze. Maybe he asks himself how it all fell apart, not knowing that I am the answer walking past him every day in heels and silence. But I don't dwell on that. I have too much left to build. I started a mentorship fund for young women in finance. It's anonymous, funded directly from the returns I salvaged after Alaric's reign of destruction. The name of the fund, the Vasquez Initiative, in honor of the woman who first believed in me. I hired Tessa Marin as Chief Strategy Officer last month. Watching her lead meetings is like watching a spark catch fire. She reminds me of me before the losses, before the grey, except she's smarter, faster, freer. I plan to give her the company someday, not in a will, not in secrecy. Openly and with pride, because this time, legacy won't be something someone steals. It'll be something someone earns. Last week, a reporter called to request an interview for a documentary about Atlanta's most influential businesswomen. She asked if I could connect her with Zephyr Larkhill's surviving family. I'm sorry, I told her. Zephyr Larkhill is no longer available for comment. She accepted that. And I smiled, because Zephyr had her moment. But now, it's ZL Hale's turn. Up next, we have two more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch, and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.